G'day, it's Paul Rowe. This is my office in Dubbo, where I've done a lot of thinking and writing. This thesis I wrote on storytelling a few years back. It's sort of been where I've brewed up my thinking, and all these resources here have become part of my life. I want to show you just something simple today that was sort of a basis for what I was saying there. It's about worldview. That worldview is the thing we look through to determine our way we do life. And one of the important parts of our worldview is the stories we tell ourselves, the stories that define us, that shape us, give us direction. And those stories inform our questions that we ask ourselves, the big questions about life. What's life really about? What's the meaning and purpose? What about living and dying? What comes next? And then we sort of make up symbols that go with that. And then that begins to become part of our habit, our character, our lifestyle. And then we go around again and we keep informing ourselves with stories that sort of build or strengthen our lifestyle. So in recent times, for example, when I'm doing stories, the reason I'm doing it is because I want to help people develop a strong, virile, robust lifestyle that really answers the big questions. So a couple of stories that I've used recently. This one came from the early part of my life when I was a boy. I got this at school as a prize. I don't know why I picked it, but I did. And it's become a really important part of my life. It's called The Miracle on the River Kwai. It's the story of a group of men thrown into a prison camp in the Second World War. And that was the acid test for all of them, for the Allied prisoners, Australians, Scots, English, and for the Japanese too, because their worldviews came into collision and into a crucible that tested them. Well, if you listen to the stories on my podcast or on the YouTube clip, you'll hear the whole story, but it's how those men had to come up with answers for the big questions. And they found that the worldview stories they'd been working with, like the British Empire, for example, and serving the British Empire, or even the mateship ethic for Australians, sort of didn't really cut it when the heat was really on. And the camp began to sink into sort of dog eat dog. And so a group of Australians came to the author of this story and said, let's investigate the story of Jesus for ourselves and see whether it works. Well, it did, and you can hear the rest of that story. So this story has become an important part of my life, and I've told it to many, many people, and I've lent it to lots of people. And they've found that it helps inform their worldview and strengthen answers to the big questions, because these fellows had to answer it. And on the other side was the Japanese. This man here, Mitsuo Fuchida, you can hear his story too, led the bombing on Pearl Harbor, led the bombing on Darwin, got back to Japan just after the atom bomb had dropped. The nation's in disarray. He's looking for answers. It's got to be more than the Bushido card. It's got to be more than just serving the emperor. He heard two stories that changed his life. One was about a young girl whose parents were missionaries in Japan. When the war came, the Japanese arrested them and then beheaded them. They died forgiving the Japanese. And when he heard that story, he's saying, what made her do that? Why would she do that? Then he heard the story of an American airman who'd been in prison camp. He'd bombed Tokyo, and so he'd been captured, put in prison and treated terribly, came out emaciated and beaten, but decided to go back to Japan because he discovered the story of Jesus while he was in prison camp, changed his life. So he went back to Japan to tell the Japanese people this. Mitsuo Fuchida heard that story, met the man, and it changed his life as well. And he went about telling that story not only in Japan, but in America as well. Well, when I tell these stories, that's what I've got in mind. I'm looking for stories that you could use. And you perhaps have stories in your life or in your bookshelves that you could use to come alongside people, particularly in times like this. In COVID times where we've all been squeezed in and barriers are put up and people are feeling very restricted and threatened and fearful. The suicide rate, particularly amongst young men in Australia, is rising. They're very serious things, and people are, I think, really asking these big questions. Are our stories, the stories that we tell ourselves in Australia, we're Australians, we've got plenty of money, we've got a great lifestyle, what else do we need? But we're realising maybe we need more than that. We need bigger answers, bigger stories to meet those questions. The other day, for example, I was sitting with a friend in hospital here in Dubbo. He was dying. And what do you say? What story do you tell a friend who's dying? Well, for me, we went back to the story of Jesus together. We'd travelled some distance, and it was that story that really gave Jeff strength. And stories like this that we'd shared were the ones when it came to the crunch, when you had to really have substantial answers to the big questions like what happens to us when we die. I know no bigger answer than the Christian story. And these stories that go with it, stories like Mutsu Ofushida, stories like the miracle of the River Kwai. We all need resources to help other people, and these times in particular. And I'm encouraging you, first to really get to know the story of Jesus so you can share it naturally with people, but also to find other stories like these that you can put alongside them that people will read and realise they've been tested. So welcome to my tool shed. I hope I've helped you think a little bit wider and understand how stories can work and what they can do for people in stressful times. I'm Paul Rowe. I'm the Outback Historian.